Welcome to the Sleepy Bat. Tonight you'll see what it was really like to live and suffer aboard a medieval ship. The wind bites harder out here. The wood beneath your feet never stops shifting. The sea is both your prison and your only hope. Forget the tales of swashbuckling pirates and brave explorers. This is the darker, quieter truth, the kind that doesn't make it into adventure stories. So grab your pillow, close your eyes, and let's drift back to the brutal life at sea. Most people imagine medieval sailors as bold adventurers chasing glory across the high seas. But what I uncovered in old maritime records and forgotten ship logs paints a far darker truth. This wasn't a life of freedom, it was a waking nightmare. Of disease, starvation, punishment, and storms so violent they turned ships into floating coffins. Yet somehow these men endured, with a resilience few today can imagine. The year is 1347. You're standing on the filthy docks of Bristol, surrounded by ships that smell of rot, waste, and desperation. You're not here chasing glory. You're here because you have no other choice. You need to know that medieval shipping was built on desperation. Captains didn't recruit skilled mariners with promises of good pay and comfortable quarters. They preyed on the desperate, the criminal, and the hopeless, because anyone with better options would never voluntarily step foot on a medieval ship. The recruiting process was brutal in its simplicity. A ship's captain or his representatives would set up in taverns near the docks. They'd buy drinks for unemployed men, tell wild stories of adventure and riches waiting across the sea. They'd promise good wages, regular meals, and a share of any treasure discovered. What they didn't mention was that most sailors never lived to collect those wages. But even if you knew the truth, even if you understood exactly what you were signing up for, you might still take the risk, because for many medieval people, life on land wasn't much better. At least at sea, there was a chance, however small, of returning with enough money to change your circumstances forever. Once you signed on, there was no backing out. Maritime law was clear. Abandoning a ship was a crime punishable by death or imprisonment. You belonged to that vessel and its captain until the voyage was complete, and completion might be months or even years away. Your first shock would come when you saw your new home. Medieval ships were not built for human comfort. They were cargo vessels with humans crammed into whatever space remained. A typical merchant cog might be 80 feet long and 25 feet wide, but most of that space was reserved for goods. The crew quarters, if you could even call them that, were usually nothing more than a section of the lower deck where men slept on bare planks. Privacy didn't exist. 50 or 60 men might share a space smaller than a modern bedroom. You'd sleep inches away from strangers, breathing their exhaled air, listening to their snores, their coughs, their whispered prayers in the darkness. And this wasn't just for a night or two. This was your reality for the entire voyage. But the cramped quarters were just the beginning of your problems. Let's talk about the food, because what passed for meals on medieval ships would horrify modern health inspectors. Your primary food source was something called hardtack, basically a rock-hard biscuit made from flour and water. When fresh, it was merely unappetizing. But after a few weeks at sea, it became infested with weevils and other insects. Sailors would often tap their hardtack on the table to shake out the bugs before eating. The joke was that the weevils added protein, but it wasn't really a joke. Meat was preserved in salt, packed in barrels that often leaked seawater. After a month at sea, this salted pork or beef would be so tough and rancid that it could barely be chewed. Sailors would sometimes carve it into buttons or other small objects because it was harder than wood. Water was an even bigger problem. Fresh water stored in wooden casks quickly became stagnant and foul. Within weeks it would be green with algae, crawling with mosquito larvae and tasting like liquid sewage. But you'd drink it anyway, because the alternative was death from thirst. Beer and wine were actually safer than water because the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria. But even these would eventually turn sour and vinegary. Imagine drinking something that tastes like spoiled vinegar mixed with seawater, knowing it's the only liquid available for the next 2 months. Scurvy was the inevitable result of this diet. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was the silent killer of medieval sailors. It started innocently enough, with fatigue and joint pain. But as weeks passed, your gums would begin to bleed and swell. Your teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen spontaneously. Your skin would develop dark, painful spots that never healed. In the final stages of scurvy, sailors would become so weak they couldn't stand. Their bodies would literally fall apart as their connective tissues dissolved. Death was often a mercy by that point, but here's what made it even more horrifying. Everyone knew this would happen. Scurvy wasn't a mysterious disease that struck randomly. It was a predictable consequence of long voyages. Captains planned for it the way modern businesses plan for overhead costs. They simply assumed they'd lose a certain percentage of their crew to disease and factored that into their calculations. The daily routine on a medieval ship was designed around one principle: keeping the vessel afloat and moving toward its destination. Everything else, including human comfort and dignity, was secondary. Your day would begin before dawn with the changing of the watch. Ships operated on a rotation system with crews divided into groups that took turns managing the vessel. When your watch began, you'd stumble up from the fetid darkness below deck into whatever weather awaited above. If you were lucky, it was a calm day with steady winds, but luck was rare at sea. More often, you'd face brutal conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. In rough weather, your job was to climb the rigging to adjust the sails. Picture this. You're 50 feet above a pitching deck, clinging to rope that's slick with ice or rain, while the ship rolls violently from side to side. One wrong step, one moment of lost grip, and you'd plummet to the deck below or disappear into the churning sea. There were no safety lines, no harnesses, no backup systems. Your survival depended entirely on your strength, balance, and luck. Men fell from the rigging regularly, their screams cut short by the sound of impact or the splash of water. Those who survived the fall onto the deck often wished they hadn't. Broken bones on a medieval ship meant permanent disability or death. There were no doctors, no proper medical supplies, no way to set complex fractures or treat internal injuries. Ship surgeons were usually failed barbers or butchers whose primary qualification was a willingness to saw off limbs without anesthesia. But the physical dangers were only part of the nightmare. The psychological pressure of life at sea was equally brutal. Imagine being trapped with the same group of men for months, knowing that a single mistake by any one of them could kill you all. Tensions ran high constantly. Arguments over food, water, sleeping space, or work assignments could explode into violence without warning. Ship discipline was maintained through fear and brutality. Captains had absolute authority over their crews, backed by maritime law that gave them the power of life and death. Punishment for even minor infractions was swift and savage. Theft of food might result in having your hand nailed to the mast for hours. Insubordination could earn you a flogging that left your back a bloody ruin. And for serious crimes like mutiny or desertion, there were punishments so cruel that men would beg for death instead. Keel-hauling was perhaps the most feared punishment. The victim would be tied to a rope that passed under the ship's hull from one side to the other. Then he'd be thrown overboard and dragged under the ship's bottom, which was covered in sharp barnacles and jagged metal fittings. Most men drowned during keel-hauling. Those who survived were so lacerated by the barnacles that they often died from infection within days. But even without formal punishment, violence was a constant presence on medieval ships. Men fought over scraps of food, over sleeping positions, over imagined slights. Knives were drawn regularly, and blood was spilled over disputes that would seem trivial on land. The close quarters meant that these conflicts couldn't be avoided or escaped. If someone decided they hated you, you'd have to live with that hatred and the threat it represented for the entire voyage. Some men were murdered in their sleep by shipmates. Others simply disappeared during night watches, their bodies never found. And through it all, the sea itself remained the greatest enemy. Medieval sailors had no weather forecasting, no radio communication, no GPS navigation. They sailed blind into whatever conditions awaited them, armed with nothing but primitive instruments and centuries-old folklore about reading wind and weather patterns. When storms struck, they struck without warning and without mercy. Picture yourself in the middle of the North Atlantic, 3 weeks out from port, when the horizon suddenly turns black. The wind, which had been steady for days, dies to an eerie stillness. The temperature drops 20 degrees in minutes, and then you hear it, a low rumble that seems to come from the bowels of the earth itself. You're about to experience what medieval sailors called God's fury, and there's absolutely nowhere to run. Medieval storms weren't just bad weather. They were apocalyptic events that could transform a sturdy vessel into kindling in minutes. Without modern weather prediction, these tempests struck like lightning, catching crews completely unprepared. The first sign was usually the wind. It would shift direction suddenly, then begin building in intensity until it howled like a living thing. The sea, which might have been relatively calm moments before, would transform into mountains of water that dwarfed the ship. Waves 30, 40, even 50 feet high would crash over the deck with the force of collapsing buildings. Men would be swept overboard instantly, their screams lost in the roar of wind and water. Others would be smashed against masts or railings, their bones shattered by the impact. But drowning was almost merciful compared to what happened to those who survived the initial assault. As the storm intensified, the ship would be thrown around like a toy. Men below deck would be hurled against the walls with bone-crushing force. Cargo would break loose and become deadly projectiles, crushing anyone in their path. The darkness below deck during a storm was absolute and terrifying. You couldn't see the objects flying toward you, couldn't brace for impact, couldn't even tell which way was up as the ship rolled and pitched violently. Men would vomit uncontrollably from seasickness, adding to the already horrific stench of the cramped quarters. Sleep became impossible. For days at a time, you'd be thrown around like a rag doll, never able to rest, never able to predict when the next impact would come. Your body would be covered in bruises, cuts, and scrapes from constant collision with wooden surfaces and metal fittings. Those lucky enough to be on deck during a storm faced a different kind of hell. They had to work the rigging in conditions that defied human capability. Imagine trying to untangle frozen rope while standing on a surface that's tilting 45 degrees in every direction, with winds so strong they could literally blow you off your feet. Ice was another killer. In northern waters, storms could coat the entire ship in a layer of ice so thick and heavy that it threatened to capsize the vessel. Sailors would have to chip away at this ice with axes and hammers while the storm raged around them, knowing that a single misstep could send them sliding off the deck into the churning sea. The psychological toll was devastating. Men would pray desperately to whatever gods they believed in, making bargains and promises in exchange for survival. Some would go mad from the terror, screaming and babbling incoherently until their shipmates had to physically restrain them. And storms could last for days. Imagine living through this nightmare for 72 hours straight, never knowing if the next wave would be the one that finally broke the ship apart. By the time the weather cleared, survivors would be physical and emotional wrecks, barely human in their exhaustion and trauma. But here's what made it even worse. Storms were just one of many ways the sea could kill you. Fire was perhaps even more terrifying than storms, because there was absolutely no escape. Medieval ships were essentially floating tinderboxes made entirely of dry wood, tar, and rope. A single candle knocked over, a spark from the galley, or lightning during a storm could turn your refuge into a blazing inferno in minutes. When fire broke out on a ship, panic was immediate and total. There was no fire department to call, no sprinkler system to activate. The only firefighting equipment was buckets of seawater, which were often useless against a blaze that had already taken hold. Men would throw themselves overboard rather than burn alive, choosing drowning over the agony of flames. Those who tried to fight the fire often died from smoke inhalation in the ship's cramped spaces. The wooden decks would burn through, creating holes that sent men plummeting into the ship's hold where they'd be trapped by debris and flame. Some fires burned so hot and fast that they consumed entire vessels in less than an hour. Survivors would find themselves floating in the open ocean with nothing but the clothes on their backs, watching their former home reduced to ash and charred timber. Pirates presented yet another form of terror that haunted every merchant voyage. These weren't the romanticized buccaneers of later centuries, but desperate, violent men who survived by preying on legitimate shipping. Medieval pirates showed no mercy. They would torture captured sailors to reveal the location of hidden cargo, then kill them to eliminate witnesses. Some victims were thrown overboard with weights tied to their feet. Others were used for target practice or simply butchered for sport. The lucky ones were sometimes offered a choice: join the pirate crew or die. But joining meant abandoning any hope of returning home and becoming a criminal yourself. It meant participating in the same brutal acts that had been inflicted on your former shipmates. Even when pirates didn't attack directly, their presence poisoned every voyage with fear. Sailors would spend weeks scanning the horizon for unknown sails, knowing that any ship they encountered might mean death or worse. Sleep became fitful and nervous, broken by every unfamiliar sound or change in the ship's movement. But perhaps the most insidious enemy wasn't storms or fire or pirates. It was something that crept aboard every ship and slowly, methodically destroyed crews from within: disease. We've already talked about scurvy, but it was just one of many illnesses that turned ships into floating morgues. Dysentery would spread through crews like wildfire, causing bloody diarrhea that dehydrated men until they died in agony. The cramped, unsanitary conditions below deck were perfect breeding grounds for every pathogen imaginable. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas, would cause high fevers and delirium. Men would become delirious, babbling nonsensically or attacking their shipmates in confused rage. The disease was so contagious that entire crews could be infected within days of the first case appearing. Plague was the ultimate nightmare. When the Black Death was raging across Europe, ships became vectors of transmission, carrying the disease from port to port. Crews would die so quickly that vessels would arrive in harbor with no living souls aboard, ghost ships drifting with their cargo of corpses. But even common infections could be deadly without proper medical care. A simple cut could become infected and lead to gangrene. Men would watch their extremities turn black and rot away while they were still alive. Amputation was sometimes attempted, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, the surgery itself was often fatal. Broken bones that weren't properly set would heal crooked, leaving men permanently disabled. Hernias from heavy lifting could become strangulated, causing excruciating pain and death. Even toothaches could become life-threatening infections that spread to the brain. The ship's surgeon, when there was one, was usually more dangerous than helpful. These men practiced a form of medicine that was more superstition than science. They believed in balancing bodily humors through bloodletting, which weakened already sick patients. They used mercury to treat various ailments, not knowing it was poisonous. Surgery was performed with the same tools used for carpentry, often without even cleaning them between patients. Amputation was done by sawing through bone while the patient was held down by several men, since effective anesthesia didn't exist. Many patients died from shock or blood loss during these procedures. The psychological impact of watching shipmates die from disease was devastating. Men would see their friends waste away slowly, knowing that they might be next. The constant presence of death created a fatalistic attitude that sapped morale and made crews more prone to despair and mutiny. Bodies couldn't be preserved on ships, so the dead were simply wrapped in canvas and thrown overboard with whatever ceremony time and conditions allowed. Watching your friends disappear into the ocean became a routine occurrence that hardened men's hearts and made them question whether they'd ever see home again. And yet, despite all these horrors, despite the almost certain knowledge that many wouldn't survive the voyage, men continued to go to sea. Some were driven by desperation, others by the slim hope of wealth, and a few by something that might be called courage or madness. The ones who survived multiple voyages developed a particular mindset, a way of thinking that allowed them to function in conditions that would break most people. They learned to live with constant danger, to find small pleasures in a world of suffering, and to form bonds with their shipmates that were stronger than family ties. These bonds were forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. When your life depended on the actions of the men around you, when you shared the same dangers and privations, relationships formed that transcended normal social boundaries. Nobleman and peasant, educated clerk and illiterate laborer all became equals in the face of the sea's indifference. Veterans would take newcomers under their wing, teaching them the countless small skills needed to survive at sea. How to tie knots that wouldn't slip in wet conditions, how to move safely on a pitching deck, how to read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather. This knowledge was literally life-saving, and experienced sailors shared it freely because crew survival meant their own survival. But even these hardened veterans had their breaking points. Some would snap without warning, attacking shipmates or throwing themselves overboard in fits of despair. Others would become so paranoid and aggressive that they had to be restrained for the safety of the crew. The isolation was perhaps the worst psychological torture. Months at sea with no contact with the outside world, no news from home. No way of knowing if your family was alive or dead. Men would obsess over memories, replaying conversations and events until they weren't sure what was real anymore. Some sailors developed elaborate fantasies about their return home, planning what they'd do with their wages, how they'd surprise their families, what stories they'd tell. These dreams became so vivid and detailed that reality often couldn't compete with them. The actual homecoming, when it finally came, was frequently a disappointment that left men eager to return to sea despite its dangers. The psychological warfare didn't end with isolation and despair. Medieval ship captains understood that controlling men's minds was just as important as controlling their bodies. They developed sophisticated systems of manipulation that would make modern cult leaders envious. Information was power, and captains hoarded it jealously. Ordinary sailors were never told their exact destination, how long the voyage would take, or what cargo they were carrying. This deliberate ignorance kept crews dependent and prevented them from making informed decisions about their own survival. Navigation was treated like sacred knowledge, passed down only to trusted officers. Common sailors might spend years at sea without learning how to read the stars or use a compass. This ensured they could never successfully mutiny and sail the ship themselves, because they literally didn't know how to get home. Captains also controlled the flow of rumors and news. They might tell the crew they were 3 days from port when they were actually 3 weeks away, or vice versa. False hope and manufactured despair were tools used to manipulate crew behavior and prevent organized resistance. Religious manipulation was another powerful weapon. Most medieval sailors were deeply superstitious, and captains exploited these beliefs ruthlessly. They'd claim that storms were punishment for the crew's sins, that calm winds meant God was displeased with their behavior, or that deaths were divine judgment on the wicked. Ship chaplains, when present, were usually in the captain's pocket. They'd preach sermons that emphasized obedience to authority, acceptance of suffering, and the righteousness of whatever mission the ship was undertaking. Questioning orders became not just insubordination but blasphemy. The most insidious control mechanism was the promise of shares in the voyage's profits. Sailors were told they'd receive a percentage of any goods sold or treasures discovered, but these promises were almost never honored. By the time the ship returned to port, mysterious expenses and accounting tricks would eat up most of the profits, leaving crew members with barely enough to survive until the next voyage. This system created a cycle of debt and dependency that trapped men in maritime service. They'd sign on for another voyage, hoping to finally earn enough to quit the sea, but each trip left them deeper in debt to ship owners and merchants. It was economic slavery disguised as adventure. The hierarchy aboard ship was rigid and brutal. At the top was the captain, whose word was literally law. Below him were officers who enforced his will through violence and intimidation. At the bottom were ordinary sailors who had no rights, no protection, and no recourse against abuse. Officers would often be recruited from different social classes than common sailors, creating built-in divisions that prevented unified resistance. A merchant's son serving as navigator would have little sympathy for peasant deckhands and vice versa. These class divisions were deliberately maintained to keep crews fractured and controllable. Sexual abuse was common and ignored by authorities. Young sailors, especially those on their first voyages, were particularly vulnerable. They had no protection from predatory officers or shipmates, and complaining would only make their situation worse. Many boys who went to sea as teenagers returned as broken men if they returned at all. The legal system offered no protection for sailors. Maritime law was written by and for ship owners and merchants. Sailors who survived brutal voyages and tried to seek justice in port courts found that their testimony was worthless against that of captains and officers. The system was designed to protect profits, not people. Even when sailors died from obvious abuse or negligence, their families had no recourse. Deaths at sea were routinely blamed on storms, disease, or accidents, regardless of the actual cause. Ship logs could be falsified with impunity, and witnesses could be intimidated or bribed into silence. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this system was how it turned victims into perpetrators. Sailors who survived long enough to gain seniority often became as brutal as their former oppressors. They'd abuse newcomers the same way they'd been abused, perpetuating cycles of violence that lasted for generations. This transformation wasn't just cruelty, it was survival. In a world where showing weakness meant death, men learned to project strength through aggression. Compassion became a luxury that few could afford, because helping others might mean your own destruction. The few who maintained their humanity despite these conditions were often the first to die. Their kindness was seen as weakness, their generosity as foolishness. The sea rewarded the ruthless and consumed the gentle, creating a selection pressure that favored the worst aspects of human nature. Yet even in this hellish environment, some men found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity. They'd share their meager rations with sick shipmates, comfort the dying, and risk punishment to help those weaker than themselves. These acts of kindness were rare and precious, like flowers blooming in a wasteland. Cerritos, secret societies sometimes formed among crew members, bound together by shared suffering and mutual protection. They'd communicate through coded gestures and whispered conversations, planning small acts of resistance or mutual aid. These groups were dangerous to join but provided the only real brotherhood available to common sailors. Stories and songs became forms of psychological survival. Men would gather in the darkness below deck to share tales from home, sing traditional ballads, or create new verses about their experiences. These moments of shared culture provided brief escapes from the horror of their daily existence. Some sailors developed elaborate mental rituals to cope with trauma. They'd create detailed imaginary worlds where they were heroes instead of victims, where their suffering had meaning and purpose. These fantasies weren't signs of madness, but desperate attempts to preserve sanity in insane conditions. Religious faith, despite being manipulated by authorities, sometimes provided genuine comfort. Men would pray privately, finding solace in beliefs that transcended their immediate circumstances. Some carried small religious tokens or relics that connected them to home and hope. The concept of honor took on special meaning among sailors. Since they had so little control over their circumstances, maintaining personal integrity became crucial to psychological survival. A man might endure horrific abuse without complaint, but would fight to the death over an insult to his character. Superstition served similar psychological functions, providing illusions of control in an uncontrollable environment. Sailors developed elaborate rituals around everything from how to board a ship to what songs could be sung in different weather conditions. These practices had no real power, but believing in them helped men feel they could influence their fate. The bond between sailors and their ships was complex and often contradictory. The vessel was simultaneously their prison and their salvation, their torture chamber and their only hope of returning home. Many sailors developed almost romantic attachments to ships, speaking of them as living beings with personalities and moods. This relationship extended to the sea itself. Despite its constant threats, experienced sailors often felt more comfortable on the water than on land. The ocean's rhythms became part of their bodies, its moods familiar and predictable in ways that human society was not. Some veterans found they couldn't sleep properly on solid ground, missing the gentle roll that had cradled them for years. The transition back to land life was often traumatic for long-term sailors. After months or years of rigid shipboard routine, the chaos and complexity of port cities could be overwhelming. Many sailors would drink heavily during shore leave, not just to celebrate survival, but to numb the psychological adjustment to normal life. Shore leave itself was a double-edged sword. After months of deprivation, sailors would often go wild with whatever money they'd earned, spending it all on alcohol, food, and prostitutes within days of reaching port. This behavior wasn't just hedonism. It was a desperate attempt to feel human again after being treated like cargo for so long. Brothels near ports specialized in serving sailors, and they understood their unique psychological needs. These weren't just places for sexual release, but spaces where men could experience gentleness, conversation, and human connection they'd been denied for months. The relationships formed were often more therapeutic than romantic. Taverns served similar functions, providing spaces where sailors could tell their stories, boast of their adventures, and connect with others who understood their experiences. These establishments became informal support networks where veterans could find work, share information, and process trauma through shared narratives. But shore leave always ended and the cycle would begin again. New contracts would be signed, new voyages planned, and the same brutal routine would resume. Each trip took its toll, wearing away at men's bodies and souls until they became hollow shells of their former selves. The lucky ones died quickly, claimed by storms or disease before the sea could completely destroy their humanity. The unlucky ones survived voyage after voyage, becoming increasingly isolated from normal human society until they belonged neither on land nor sea but existed in a liminal space between worlds. Some sailors eventually found ways to escape the cycle. They might save enough money to buy into a ship or start a business on land. Others used their knowledge of foreign ports and trade routes to become merchants themselves. A few joined the clergy, seeking redemption for the violence they'd witnessed and participated in. But for every success story, there were dozens of men who never escaped. They'd die in foreign ports, far from home and family, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves or fed to the fish. Their stories would die with them, lost to history except for occasional mentions in ship logs or court records. The impact on families left behind was devastating. Wives would wait years for husbands who might never return, unable to remarry or move on with their lives. Children would grow up without fathers, raised on stories and promises that might never be fulfilled. Entire communities could be hollowed out by the sea's appetite for young men. Yet despite all this suffering, despite the almost certain knowledge of what awaited them, new recruits continued to sign on for voyages. The cycle of desperation, exploitation, and death continued year after year, voyage after voyage, as medieval society fed its young men to the hungry sea in exchange for trade routes and profits. The true cost of medieval maritime commerce wasn't measured in gold or goods, but in human lives and suffering. Every spice that reached European tables, every exotic fabric that graced noble courts, every map that expanded human knowledge was paid for with the blood and tears of men who died forgotten in the depths of the ocean. This was the reality of medieval sailing, not the romantic adventure of popular imagination, but a grinding machine of human misery that consumed lives with industrial efficiency. The men who served aboard these vessels weren't heroes or adventurers, but victims of a system that valued cargo more than human life, profits more than basic dignity, and yet somehow some of them survived. Some found ways to endure the unendurable, to maintain their humanity in inhuman conditions, and to return home with stories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their resilience in the face of impossible odds speaks to something fundamental about the human spirit. Our capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. But that resilience came at a price. The men who survived multiple voyages were forever changed by their experiences, marked by trauma that ran deeper than any physical scar. They carried the sea within them, its rhythms and dangers, its beauty and terror, until the day they died. The medieval period eventually ended and sailing technology improved, but the basic dynamic remained the same for centuries. Men would continue to risk everything for the promise of adventure and fortune, and the sea would continue to take its toll, claiming lives with the same indifferent appetite it had shown their medieval predecessors. Understanding this history isn't just about honoring the memory of forgotten sailors, it's about recognizing patterns of exploitation and abuse that persist in different forms today. The same forces that drove desperate men to sea in medieval times, poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic inequality, continue to shape human behavior and suffering in our modern world. The courage and endurance of medieval sailors reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary resilience when circumstances demand it. But it also reminds us that no one should have to endure such conditions and that systems built on human suffering are ultimately unsustainable and immoral. The survivors who made it back to port carried more than just physical scars. They brought with them a darkness that would never fully leave. You could spot a veteran sailor from across a crowded tavern. There was something in their eyes, a hollow distance that spoke of things no man should ever witness. These weren't the same people who had walked up those gangplanks months or years earlier. The sea had a way of stripping away everything soft and human, leaving behind something harder, colder, more pragmatic. They'd learned to calculate the value of a human life in terms of fresh water rations. They'd watched friends die and felt nothing but relief that it meant more food for the survivors. But here's what really disturbed me during my research. Many of these broken men would sign up for another voyage within weeks of returning home. Not because they loved the sea, not because they craved adventure, but because they literally couldn't function in normal society anymore. Imagine trying to sleep in a bed that doesn't rock. Imagine sitting down to a meal and not automatically calculating how long the food would last if rationed properly. Imagine having a conversation with someone who's never watched a man's teeth fall out from scurvy, never held a dying friend's hand as he begged for water you didn't have to give. The psychological damage was so profound that many sailors became addicted to the very environment that had traumatized them. They'd spend their shore leave drinking themselves into oblivion, trying to forget what they'd seen. But the moment their money ran out, they'd be back at the docks, signing articles for another voyage to hell. Ship captains knew this and exploited it ruthlessly. They'd deliberately seek out these damaged veterans because they were predictable, controllable, and had already been broken by the system. A man who'd survived 3 voyages was more valuable than 10 fresh recruits, not because he was skilled, but because his spirit had already been crushed. The recruitment process for these veterans was different. No false promises of adventure or riches, just a simple transaction. The captain would find them in their usual haunts, usually drunk and desperate, and offer them an advance on their wages. Enough money to pay their debts, buy a few more bottles, maybe send something home to their families. By the time they sobered up, they'd already signed the articles and were legally bound to the voyage. It was a trap that exploited their addiction, their desperation, and their inability to imagine any other kind of life. But the most insidious part wasn't the recruitment. It was how these veterans were used to control new sailors. Fresh recruits would look up to anyone who'd survived multiple voyages, seeing them as examples of what was possible. What they didn't realize was that survival had come at the cost of everything that made these men human. Veterans would tell newcomers that the brutality was necessary, that the harsh conditions were just part of life at sea, that anyone who couldn't handle it was weak. They'd become enforcers of the same system that had destroyed them, perpetuating cycles of abuse because they literally couldn't imagine alternatives. I found ship logs where captains would deliberately pair new sailors with these broken veterans, knowing that the psychological conditioning would be more effective than any amount of physical punishment. A young man might survive a flogging, but watching a respected veteran accept degradation without complaint would teach him that resistance was futile. The veteran sailors had developed their own twisted code of honor around endurance. They'd brag about surviving on less food, sleeping in worse conditions, or working through injuries that would hospitalize modern workers. This wasn't courage. It was learned helplessness disguised as pride. They'd compete with each other over who had suffered the most, who had endured the worst conditions, who had lost the most friends. These conversations served multiple purposes. They processed trauma through storytelling. They established social hierarchies based on survival. And they normalized experiences that should have been recognized as criminal abuse. New sailors would listen to these stories with a mixture of horror and fascination, not understanding that they were being psychologically prepared for their own destruction. The veterans weren't sharing wisdom. They were spreading infection, passing on the mental conditioning that would help them accept the unacceptable. But some recruits saw through the manipulation. These were usually the ones who didn't last long. Either they'd find ways to escape before their first voyage ended, or they'd die because they couldn't adapt to the brutal realities of ship life. The system was designed to eliminate anyone who couldn't be broken and remade in its image. The few who maintained their humanity while surviving multiple voyages were genuinely extraordinary individuals. They'd learned to compartmentalize their experiences, to separate their survival instincts from their core values. These men often became informal leaders among the crews, providing guidance and protection for newer sailors without becoming tools of oppression themselves. But they paid a heavy price for maintaining their integrity. They'd often suffer in silence rather than participate in the casual cruelty that made life easier for others. They'd share their rations with sick shipmates even when they were starving themselves. They'd risk punishment to protect weaker crew members from abuse. These moral survivors were rare and precious, like diamonds formed under impossible pressure. They proved that the human spirit could endure even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. But their very existence highlighted just how thoroughly the system corrupted most of the men who passed through it. The transformation wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. A new sailor might start by simply staying quiet when he witnessed abuse. Then he'd stop helping others to avoid drawing attention to himself. Eventually, he'd participate in the cruelty because it was easier than being a target. Each small compromise made the next one easier. Each act of self-preservation chipped away at the person he'd been on land. By the time a sailor realized what he was becoming, it was usually too late to change course. The sea had claimed another soul, even if the body survived. The worst part was that this psychological destruction was completely unnecessary. Ships could have been supplied with better food, cleaner water, and basic medical care. Crews could have been given adequate living space and reasonable working conditions. The technology existed, it was simply more profitable to treat sailors as disposable resources. Ship owners and merchants made conscious decisions to prioritize cargo space over crew welfare, to cut costs by providing inadequate supplies, to maintain discipline through terror rather than fair treatment. Every aspect of the system was designed to maximize profits while externalizing the human costs onto men who had no power to resist. The legal framework supported this exploitation at every level. Maritime law gave captains nearly unlimited authority over their crews while providing no meaningful protections for sailors. Port authorities were more concerned with trade revenues than working conditions. Insurance policies covered lost cargo but not lost lives. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate design choice made by people who had the power to create better systems but chose not to. The suffering of medieval sailors wasn't a tragic necessity of the times, but a conscious sacrifice made to protect profit margins and maintain existing power structures. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual ships to entire port communities. Taverns, brothels, and boarding houses all participated in a system designed to keep sailors trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. They'd extend credit during shore leave, knowing that desperate men would sign up for dangerous voyages to pay their bills. Local authorities often cooperated with ship captains to track down deserters or press gang unwilling recruits. The entire infrastructure of port cities was built around feeding young men to the maritime machine, processing them like any other commodity needed for trade. Religious institutions played their part too, preaching sermons about duty, obedience, and accepting one's lot in life. They'd offer prayers for safe voyages while blessing ships that they knew would return with fewer crew members than they'd departed with. The church profited from maritime trade while providing spiritual justification for the suffering it required. Families were complicit too, often out of desperation rather than choice. Parents would encourage sons to go to sea because it meant one less mouth to feed, and the possibility, however remote, of money sent home. Wives would push husbands toward the docks because shore employment wasn't available or didn't pay enough to survive. This created communities where maritime service was seen as inevitable for young men, where families planned their lives around the assumption that their sons and husbands would spend years at sea. The psychological normalization of this system made it almost impossible for individuals to resist or imagine alternatives. Children grew up hearing stories of the sea that emphasized adventure and opportunity while downplaying the brutal realities. They'd play games that mimicked ship life, unknowingly preparing themselves for futures of exploitation and abuse. By the time they were old enough to understand the truth, they were already psychologically conditioned to accept it. The few voices that spoke out against this system were quickly silenced or marginalized. Sailors who tried to organize for better conditions were blacklisted from employment. Merchants who treated their crews humanely were undercut by competitors willing to sacrifice human welfare for lower costs. Reform movements existed but faced enormous obstacles. The profits from maritime trade were too important to too many powerful people. Any changes that might reduce those profits even slightly were met with fierce resistance from established interests. The system was also international, which made reform even more difficult. A country that imposed better working conditions on its ships might simply see trade shift to nations with more exploitative practices. This created a race to the bottom where human welfare was sacrificed to maintain competitive advantage. Individual ship captains who wanted to treat their crews better often found themselves constrained by economic realities. They had to deliver cargo on schedule and within budget, which meant they couldn't afford the luxury of adequate food, medicine, or living space for their sailors. The most successful captains were often the most ruthless, not because cruelty was inherently effective, but because it was cheaper than alternatives. A captain who ruled through fear didn't need to invest in crew welfare or motivation. He could focus entirely on moving cargo as quickly and cheaply as possible. This created a selection pressure that favored the worst aspects of human nature in maritime leadership. Kind, decent men either left the profession or were driven out by competition from those willing to treat sailors as expendable resources. The psychological impact extended to shore-based maritime industries as well. Shipbuilders designed vessels with no consideration for crew comfort because they weren't paid to care about sailor welfare. Merchants negotiated contracts that prioritized cargo capacity over human needs because that's what maximized their profits. Insurance companies calculated their rates based on expected cargo losses, not human casualties. They'd rather pay out claims for damaged goods than invest in safety measures that might prevent deaths. The mathematical logic of commerce reduced human lives to statistical probabilities and acceptable losses. Even the maps and navigation tools of the era reflected these priorities. They showed trade routes, harbors, and cargo opportunities in exquisite detail while providing little information about crew safety, medical facilities, or emergency shelters. The tools of the trade were designed around moving goods, not protecting people. The knowledge that did exist about crew welfare was often kept secret or ignored. Ship surgeons who developed better treatment methods found their innovations suppressed if they increased costs. Captains who discovered more humane management techniques were discouraged from sharing them if they reduced short-term profits. This systematic suppression of knowledge meant that each ship operated in isolation, unable to learn from others' experiences or build on collective wisdom about crew management. The same mistakes were repeated voyage after voyage. The same preventable deaths occurred over and over because sharing information might reduce competitive advantages. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that many sailors never questioned the system even after it had destroyed their lives. They'd blame themselves for their suffering, convinced that they simply weren't strong enough or tough enough to thrive at sea. This self-blame prevented them from recognizing the systematic nature of their exploitation. Veterans would often become the most vocal defenders of the brutal system that had broken them, arguing that any changes would make sailors soft or weak. They genuinely believed that the suffering they'd endured had made them better men, even as the evidence of their psychological damage was obvious to anyone who looked. This psychological Stockholm syndrome extended to entire maritime communities. Port cities would take pride in their reputation for producing tough sailors, celebrating the very conditions that destroyed so many of their young men. The culture of suffering became a source of identity and twisted honor. The normalization was so complete that alternatives became literally unthinkable. Sailors couldn't imagine ships with adequate food, clean water, or humane working conditions because they'd never experienced or even heard of such things. The brutal reality they knew seemed like the only possible reality. But here's what really haunts me about this history. The system worked exactly as intended. It produced enormous wealth for ship owners and merchants while transferring all the costs onto people who had no power to resist. The suffering wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The men who designed and maintained this system weren't ignorant of its human costs. They made deliberate choices to prioritize profits over people, knowing full well what those choices meant for the sailors under their control. They created elaborate justifications for their decisions, but at heart they simply valued money more than human life. And the most disturbing part, similar systems exist today in different forms but with the same basic logic. Whenever we see workers treated as disposable resources, whenever we see safety regulations ignored to cut costs, whenever we see human suffering dismissed as an acceptable cost of doing business, we're seeing the same mentality that sent medieval sailors to their deaths in pursuit of profit. The legacy of medieval maritime exploitation isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when economic systems are allowed to operate without meaningful constraints on their treatment of human beings. The specific technologies and legal frameworks have changed, but the underlying dynamics remain depressingly familiar. Understanding this history matters because it shows us how systematic dehumanization works, how entire societies can normalize the most extreme forms of exploitation, and how individual resistance becomes almost impossible when everyone around you has been conditioned to accept the unacceptable. But it also shows us something else, that even in the most hopeless circumstances, some people find ways to maintain their humanity, to help others, and to resist the forces that would destroy their souls. The medieval sailors who survived with their dignity intact prove that the human spirit can endure anything, even when everything around them is designed to break it. Their stories remind us that we have choices even when those choices seem impossible. We can choose to see other people as human beings rather than resources. We can choose to resist systems that treat suffering as acceptable. We can choose to remember the forgotten victims of progress and make sure their sacrifices weren't meaningless. The brutal life of medieval sailors at sea wasn't just a historical tragedy. It was a test of human nature under extreme conditions. Some people failed that test spectacularly, creating and maintaining systems of incredible cruelty. But others passed it, proving that compassion and dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy them. That's a lesson we need to remember because the test isn't over. It never really ends. Every generation faces its own version of the choice between treating people as human beings or as disposable resources. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental moral challenge remains the same. The medieval sailors who suffered and died in pursuit of other people's profits deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who faced impossible choices with whatever courage and dignity they could muster. Their stories are part of our shared human heritage, reminders of both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for resilience. And their legacy poses a question that each of us must answer. When faced with systems that dehumanize and exploit, will we participate, resist, or simply look away? The choice we make defines not just our own character, but the kind of world we create for future generations. The sea may have claimed countless medieval sailors, but their stories survive to challenge us, to make us uncomfortable, and to demand that we do better. That's perhaps the only meaning we can find in their suffering, that it serves as a warning and an inspiration for those of us lucky enough to live in times and places where we still have the power to choose. But the choice is ours to make, and the clock is always ticking. The sea is still hungry, and there are always new forms of exploitation waiting to claim new victims. The question is whether we'll learn from the past or repeat its mistakes, whether we'll honor the memory of the forgotten sailors or add new names to the role of the exploited and abandoned. Their voices call to us across the centuries, not asking for pity or revenge, but for remembrance and resolve. They ask us to see clearly, to choose wisely, and to never forget that behind every statistic, every profit margin, and every success story, there are human beings whose lives matter just as much as our own. That question becomes even more urgent when you realize that the patterns I've been describing didn't end with the medieval period. They evolved, adapted, and found new forms, but the fundamental dynamic remained the same. The Industrial Revolution simply scaled up the machinery of human exploitation, and globalization spread it across the planet. Today, we see the same logic playing out in sweatshops, in migrant worker programs, in the gig economy. Different technologies, different legal frameworks, but the same basic calculation. Human suffering is acceptable if it keeps costs down and profits up. The same psychological conditioning that made medieval sailors blame themselves for their exploitation now convinces modern workers that their struggles are personal failures rather than systemic problems. The shipping containers that carry our goods across modern oceans are filled with products made by people whose working conditions would be familiar to any medieval sailor. The global supply chains that bring us cheap electronics and fast fashion are built on the same foundation of disposable human labor that once filled the holds of medieval merchant ships. But here's what gives me hope. The very fact that we can recognize these patterns means we have the power to change them. The medieval sailors who suffered in anonymity and silence couldn't tell their stories to the world. Their voices were lost in the wind and waves, their experiences buried with their bones at the bottom of the sea. We have advantages they never had. We have communication technologies that can expose exploitation instantly. We have legal frameworks that at least pretend to protect human rights. We have economic systems that, however imperfect, allow for more choices than medieval peasants ever dreamed of. Most importantly, we have their stories. Every account of medieval maritime brutality, every description of systematic dehumanization, every example of courage in the face of impossible odds serves as both warning and inspiration. These dead sailors have become our teachers, showing us what happens when we allow economic logic to override human decency. Their experiences teach us to recognize the early warning signs of systematic exploitation. When we see workers being treated as interchangeable parts, when we hear suffering dismissed as necessary for competitiveness, when we witness the normalization of conditions that would have horrified previous generations. These are the same patterns that turned medieval ships into floating prisons. But their stories also show us that resistance is possible, even under the most hopeless circumstances. Every act of kindness between shipmates, every refusal to participate in cruelty, every moment of solidarity in the face of systematic oppression proves that human dignity can survive anything. The medieval sailors who shared their last biscuit with a sick shipmate, who risked punishment to help a fallen comrade, who maintained their humanity while everything around them was designed to destroy it. These men created templates for resistance that we can follow today. Their courage wasn't grand or heroic in the Hollywood sense. It was quiet, persistent, and often invisible to anyone but its recipients. But it was real, and it mattered. And it changed the lives of people who had been written off as expendable. That's the kind of courage we need today. Not the flashy heroism of movies and legends, but the steady determination to treat other human beings with dignity, even when the systems around us reward cruelty and indifference. Every time we choose to see the person behind the service worker, every time we refuse to participate in the dehumanization of people we disagree with, every time we recognize that someone else's suffering matters as much as our own, we're honoring the memory of those forgotten sailors and proving that their deaths weren't meaningless. The sea took their bodies, but it couldn't take their example. Their stories live on in every act of compassion, every moment of solidarity, every refusal to accept that human suffering is the price of progress. And that's ultimately why I spent 6 months researching their experiences, why I've shared these disturbing details with you today. Not to horrify or depress you, but to honor their memory and learn from their example. These men faced the worst that human nature could devise and somehow found ways to remain human. If they could do that under those circumstances, then surely we can find the courage to face our own challenges with the same dignity and determination. Their voices call to us across the centuries, not with complaints or demands for pity, but with a simple message. Remember us, learn from us, and do better than we were allowed to do. The brutal life of medieval sailors at sea wasn't just a historical tragedy. It was a masterclass in human resilience, a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit, and a warning about what happens when we forget that every person matters. So the next time you look out at the ocean, remember that those waves once carried ships full of men who suffered unimaginably. so that the world could become more connected, more prosperous, more global. Their sacrifice built the foundation of our modern world, and we owe them more than just acknowledgement. We owe them the commitment to ensure that such systematic brutality never becomes normalized again. The sea keeps its secrets, but their stories live on in us. And as long as we remember them, as long as we learn from their experiences, as long as we refuse to let their suffering be forgotten or repeated, then those medieval sailors will have achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of wealth or power could ever purchase. Their legacy isn't written in stone or bronze, but in every choice we make to value human dignity over profit, compassion over convenience, and justice over expedience. That's the true monument to their memory, and it's one that each of us helps build every single day. If this journey into the brutal reality of medieval maritime life has affected you the way it affected me, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and share this video with others. These stories need to be told, these voices need to be heard, and these lessons need to be learned by each new generation. Because the sea is still out there, still hungry, still waiting, and until we learn to value human life above all else, it will keep claiming new victims in new forms. But if we remember the courage of those medieval sailors, if we learn from their resilience and honor their sacrifice, then maybe, just maybe, we can build a world where no one has to choose between dignity and survival. The choice, as always, is ours.